Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
And we are looking at scenes from a marriage.
Johan, tror du verkligen att två människor kan leva tillsammans hela livet?
En jävla befängd konvention som jag vet inte var så. Man skulle ha 5-årskontrakt eller avtal som löpte från år till år som man kunde säga upp.
Skulle vi också ha det då?
Nej, inte du och jag inte.
Men varför inte vi då?
Vi är undantaget som bekräftar regeln.
Så du tror att vi kommer till att leva tillsammans hela livet?
En konstig fråga.
Sörjer du aldrig över det att du inte ska få ligga med någon annan än mig?
Nej, gör du?
Ibland.
Jaså, det var som fan.
Det är bara en rent teoretisk saknad.
Jag undrar om det är något fel på mig, ja. Eftersom jag inte har den där sortens fantasier. Jag är nöjd, ja.
Ja, men det är jag med. Ja, nu vet jag.
Jaha.
Jag vet varför Katarina och Peter har ett helvete med varandra.
Jaså?
De talar inte samma språk. De måste översätta till ett tredje begripligt språk för att de ska fatta vad de menar.
Jag tror att det är mycket enklare än så.
Se på oss, vi talar ju om allt möjligt och förstår varandra på ögonblicket. Det är för att vi talar samma språk.
Ja.
Det är därför vi har det så bra.
Jag tror att det är pengarna.
Om man talar samma språk och litar på varandra så spelar det med pengarna ingen roll.
Det med dina språk.
Men jag ser ju det där i mitt jobb ideligen. Ibland är det som man och hustru talade rikssamtal till varandra på trasiga telefoner. Och ibland är det som man lyssnar på två programmerade bandspelare. Ibland är det bara den stora interplanetariska tystnaden. Jag vet inte vad som är hemskast.
I was very taken aback by Scenes from a Marriage. In fact, this is definitely one of Bergman's most powerful films. Scenes from a Marriage had a huge impact on Swedish society when it came out. And I think for Ingmar Bergman himself, it was also a significant film. This was a miniseries he created for television, so it sort of had a different structure than we had seen in a lot of Bergman's other films. But before we get to that, I think it's important to note the environment that Scenes from a Marriage was released in. Now, it clearly resonated with people in Sweden because it was a huge ratings success.
Yeah, at the time this came out, it was definitely atypical to how relationships and families were portrayed on television.
There was All in the Family in the United States and the Waltons. I mean, this obviously wasn't what was prominent in Sweden, but I think it gives you an idea of how things were sort of simplified, and Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage is anything but simple. In fact, the miniseries as a medium gives Bergman all of the opportunities to make this as complex and rich as possible. The script, the acting, the subtlety, just runs throughout it. It was really special to me.
What the miniseries winds up being is sort of an examination of the middle class, but of course this is Bergman doing it, so it's not really the overarching criticism of the middle class or suburban lifestyle that you would expect from a lot of other directors, even of the time. But what Bergman's doing is questioning the relationship, questioning the structure that everything is built on. But he does it by focusing on this one couple, and that's what I think is really effective, because through them, he examines all of us in many ways.
A lot of that comes down to the script, but I think his choices in casting also bring a lot of strength. Mm-hmm. It's the first time we've seen Erland Josephson in a primary lead role, playing alongside Liv. And I thought the pairing of them was very natural and authentic, and they really worked together really well. Like, I couldn't imagine some of his other, favorite actors like Max von Sydow in the role.
Yeah, their delivery of the dialogue makes the film feel very realistic and sort of takes it to a core that I think a lot of the other actors might have not been able to achieve. All the walls are taken down, and it's not done through, pouring out of tears or any sort of emotional sentimentality. There is some true realism in this film that I found particularly affecting. But I think before we get into the discussion of the details of Scenes from a Marriage, we should talk about how we consumed the film, because there is a lot of debate over how a viewer should approach the movie. There's a mini-series version, which is the one that originally aired on television. The deterrent for some people is that it's incredibly long. It runs just short of 6 hours in total, and basically covers a couple of evenings. Then there's the theatrical version, which Bergman cut down. Now, we don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that in particular because we have a separate video for that. So if you head over to the link that we're going to provide, you can watch our brief discussion on which version you should perhaps start with, or if you're only going to pick one, which one you should choose. That said, we watched both, but we're going to spend most of our time here talking about the mini-series.
So we chose to watch the movie kind of progressively, and we watched 2 episodes per sitting, which took us a total of 3 evenings. Mm-hmm. And that was interesting because it really allowed the episodes to kind of make an impact and ruminate a little bit. And then by the time you got around to watching the next two, you already wanted to see what the next saga was about. But I can't say that I've come to a conclusion about what I think is best. Like if somebody were to sit down and just kind of binge and watch all 6 in a row, if you were inclined to do that, I don't know if they would necessarily enjoy it more or less than we did watching it kind of sequentially.
See, I feel like there is a lot of benefit to having a little while to think about the characters, and there's a lot of passage of time between these different chapters.
When he created it, he chose this medium specifically, and he knew that he was only allowed to have 1-hour installments once a week, and so he specifically crafted the narrative breaks, the scenes, the way that characters and themes were introduced throughout the 6-hour period to correspond with those chapters. So what I would say is, I don't know if it's better or worse, but it's perhaps more authentic if you watch them with intervals in between each hour.
So let's talk about the production in particular. I want to start with how the film opens. Bergman has been known for basically pulling back the curtain and revealing to us that this is a constructed production. And what he does here is really interesting because there's different layers to the construction as we see this couple sit with a reporter and pose for a magazine.
And it's interesting that Bergman chooses this whole media perspective to tell us about what is truth and what is fiction. So we get these layers, as you say, of, people expressing their own truth to a medium that will then be edited and republished and repackaged for other people to consume. And here we are as an actual audience consuming the reality that Bergman is serving up to us. So again, it's like this very familiar but also different approach to what he's done with other films before.
It's interesting how complex it is, and I think it's easy to sort of brush it off, but you have the reporter sitting in the room directing the cameraman what to take a picture of, and also directing the couple how to pose. Of course, we see them and we know that what's on the surface is not really what the truth is. There's a lack of passion in their relationship, and it feels like everything's a little stilted, like they're on a script.
And it's more than just the discomfort of being interviewed and photographed.
Right. Yeah, it's like Marianne is looking at her husband for a little bit of direction, and he's sort of controlling her in a very indirect way. The whole scene is incredibly uncomfortable.
And awkward. And you can see how conscious they are of the image they want to portray, that they want others to see of them. I think for most people who have watched any Bergman before, we are very quick to pick up the lack of authenticity and the likely criticism that Bergman is offering by having Marianne and Johan portrayed in that way at the beginning. But just in case you missed it, he very clearly brings another couple into the scene that become kind of the antithesis to Marianne and Johan's fakeness and the reality of what an actual married couple who's been together for a long time would really be like.
It's a really emphasized reality, though, to be fair. There's couples sitting in front of their friends and arguing like it's a massive war. But what's interesting about it is that passion and that authenticity is existent. It might be incredibly negative, but it also is the only realism in this room.
Well, absolutely. And you have to assume that, if they've gotten to the point where they hate each other so much, that probably originated from a place of where they were really passionate about each other in the other direction.
But these two scenes are really just setting the stage for everything that comes after, because it's the only real glimmer we get of whatever relationship existed before these scenes from a marriage. We never knew about Marianne and Johan before. We don't know what they were like. We don't know when the truths and the lies developed. But we do start to see the lies and the cracks appear very quickly.
I think if we know anything about Bergman, we know that this kind of suspended, passive, fake atmosphere is just simply not going to last. And so he very quickly, towards the end of the last episode, brings us to a very constructed calamity that is a crisis that really starts to tear the lid off of everything that Johan and Marianne keep trying to contain and put a nice wrapper on. So basically, Marianne, whose emotional state has essentially atrophied, is so desperate to feel something and to have a real emotional connection with her husband that she forgets to take her birth control and has an unexpected pregnancy. The sad part is she tries to use that as an opportunity to jumpstart their marriage, to try and bring some semblance of passion or connection or enjoyment to a relationship that has clearly become really, really stale and obsolete.
Their sex life is a disaster. They're both finding every single reason not to engage in any sort of sexuality, basically. And that is really where the phrase started. But, you know, the blurring of truth and fiction were very confusing because the abortion itself Bergman doesn't spend a lot of time on it. But in the miniseries version, you believe one truth about the abortion that in the recap that starts the next episode seems to be slightly different. So, you know, I'm thinking of what Johan does, and I believe in the way it plays out is he doesn't agree to the abortion. And then within the recap, it says that Johan did. So I don't really understand what happens there.
I think the reason for that is because Johan and Marianne have fallen into this rhythm of pleasantries. They're so used to just saying nice things about themselves to other people, saying nice things about each other to themselves, always self-validating how great their relationship is and how they don't really need to be in love. They don't really need to have passion. They have the perfect marriage. But the reality is that they're not ready to have a child. They don't want to have that difficulty in their life. And when that truth is exposed, there's no way that they can go back to just a simple, fake little life where everything is comfortable and is neatly in its place. And so when that emotion comes spilling out, when Marianne realizes that she feels betrayed, that she's upset, that her substitute for intimacy didn't work out as she planned, she can't just go back to the acting. And things start to come apart at the seams. Another thing that we start to see in the second episode become detached is the willingness of both Johan and Marianne to comply with the expectations of others, whether it's pop cultural things, societal things, or even people that are around them, like their colleagues or their parents. So prior to that, a lot of the acting was simply trying to fulfill or live up to certain expectations. And now we see the erosion of those obligations, and each of them does it in their own way. In this episode, it's not quite as obvious, but later on we see that Marianne does it through a path of trying to develop herself as an individual, whereas Johan does it through, in my opinion, a more degenerative and kind of rebellious way, or as some would say, a midlife crisis.
And I guess you're really getting at Paula there, right? The woman with a name but no face. And It's interesting how Bergman presents her because we don't get a face, but Marianne sees her face. Johan shows her a photo. I guess that's a smart decision though, because it leaves us without judging in that way, because we're so tempted to judge this entire relationship, especially you.
Oh no, I'm judging. Yeah, I'm judging.
It's by episode 3, I think, where you got very passionate about your emotions with the series.
Well, it was difficult because the first episode, you feel like you're well situated as a viewer. Like, I know Bergman, I've seen this before, I can understand what he's doing, isn't it clever how complex he's being, but making it seem so simple. And by the time the second episode rolls around, you feel really invested in the characters. You've already seen some of their flaws, you've seen some of the tears, you've seen some of the smiles, fake or real.
You relate to a lot of what you're seeing in some way.
Yes, I think for me in particular, what I take away from Scenes from a Marriage is how relatable it actually is. And I think that's what captivated a lot of audiences, is that even if you don't necessarily see yourself in Marianne or in Johan, you certainly recognize the flavors of certain scenes in your own life. And it's very easy to inject yourself into their drama and to think about how you would feel or how you would react if someone were to treat you or if you were confronted with that kind of situation. And so by episode 3, by the time Johan's mistress rolls around, me personally, I was completely invested and I felt infuriated by the situation and really shocked, actually, at how the scene escalated.
The scene where Johan reveals that he is having an affair hits you like a bomb. As a viewer, you don't know any of this is going on. You kind of suspect, obviously, this might happen at some point, but I didn't see it happening then. And the real separation in the way that Marianne responds and the way that Johan treats her is perhaps most stunning. You expect that she might put her foot down or at least be angry, but the exact opposite happens. And I think that's what really triggered some fury in you as I sat beside you and clutched the phone in case you might put me in danger.
Okay, fair enough. I might have overreacted.
Just a bit. I think you yelled, pick a side at the screen.
But the thing is, okay, I recognize that it came out of left field, and she was actually starting to feel sort of optimistic about the relationship. She got over, the loss of the child and the poor decision that they made together or whatever. But her passivity and her acceptance and just, she took shelter in trying to recreate that mundaneness of their life. It just drove me insane. That's the part when you have the most room as, kind of the cheated spouse to rage and to really engage with your true emotion. And for me, it felt like such a failure on her part to really only to start feeling upset and betrayed, not when he disclosed to her how horrid he'd been and all those things that he said about his relationship with Paul. It was just appalling. But she actually got truly emotional when she found out that he had been talking about this affair to all of their friends prior to telling her the truth about it. So that a lot of other people were in the know and she was not. So she ended up looking like the fool. So it's, in a way, she's been twice cuckolded, if you will. And that's what truly, at the end, hurt her the most and really got her to engage with her own emotion. And I thought that was so stunted.
I think we also both had a very strong reaction to Bergman's decision to take the children out of the story. They didn't really have much of a prominent visual role early on. You saw them sitting with their parents. But there wasn't a lot of concern from Johan about the future of the children or how his absence as he, goes off to a hotel and has a fling with Paula might hurt his family, not just Marianne.
Yeah, he was actually quite flippant about it, which again was another thing that infuriated me. And that's why I say that his progression as a character throughout the rest of the episodes was really degenerative, is because instead of, growing as a human being, and even though he's made errors or maybe chosen a different path, like there's nothing wrong with getting divorced or recognizing you don't have passion for your spouse anymore, although it's sad. But it's just the way that he did it, how careless he was, how intentionally mean and little, and that he absolutely refused to take any responsibility for his children and specifically declined to care about the impact that it would clearly have on their lives.
Which raises the question of how Johan might have reacted if he didn't have two daughters, but rather had two sons. And I think that also presents the issue of how Bergman portrays masculinity and femininity, men and women in this film, and what he might be saying about each.
That's a challenge. I feel like you could really go down the rabbit hole in trying to, have really strong opinions about it one way or the other. Because in a way it's kind of personal. With Johan's character in particular, when I think about it, sometimes I feel like maybe Bergman was a little bit too harsh on the character in the way that he chose to portray him. Because, the whole misogynistic aspect was really there kind of from the beginning. Like, he has these snarky little comments or even sometimes entire tirades about, the place of women in society or women in work and all these kinds of things. So
he also winds up becoming the absent man, who we've seen in many other Bergman films before. The man who maybe makes a phone call or shows up when he feels it's best for himself, and then disappears doing God knows what, while his wife or his girlfriend waits.
I don't think that Bergman is forgiving about that, though. And that's the interesting thing for me, is he makes Johan's character such a cliche throughout the entire series. And he keeps lowering his stance further and further and further. And I think moves him back, across the 10 years, Johan does not advance as a human being as much as Marianne does. She ends up being a much more noble and self-actualized character than he does.
What you're referring to there is the midlife crisis, the cliche midlife crisis that he sort of saddles Johan with. He's the professor that runs away with his student. They have wild sex in a hotel in Paris, no less. He's completely careless. He's just, driving on his energy of the youth that maybe he lost or never had. And, assuming that all of the other cliches exist, maybe he had a nice car in there somewhere that we didn't see as well. Johan is essentially looking for these external stimulations to provide, I guess, some sort of validation for his life. And that's a complete contrast to what Marianne is doing.
For sure, Marianne seems to use this opportunity to look inward, whereas we get her self-reflection later on where she describes how she's kind of built herself up as a person based on other people's expectations of her, and her everything has always been reactive to like society and what a woman ought to be. And she really uses this crisis and this breakdown to kind of discover her own true motivations and to build herself back up from the inside out.
So at the middle of the series, I think we're at a real inflection point for the relationship of the main characters in Scenes from a Marriage. And perhaps we should leave it there because I think it's very interesting where Bergman decides to take them from this point. It wasn't where I expected, at least. So that brings us to the end of the first part of our two-part discussion on Scenes from a Marriage. Be sure to engage in the discussion and subscribe to the channel.
Or like us on Facebook.
And join us next time where we will continue the conversation on Scenes from a Marriage here on Breaking Down Bergman.